Alleluia, Christ is risen, the Lord is risen indeed. Alleluia. How wonderful it is to say these words, and how wonderful it is to be together to say them, even though we're not together in our ancient, traditional, and usual way. Emmanuel, God is with us as we are together. Emmanuel is not just a Christmas thing, of course. Jesus came at Christmas in order to do the saving work of the cross and of the resurrection. So God is with us again through the resurrection. Emmanuel, all this, God's presence in Jesus, along with Jesus' willing death on the cross, plus the beauty and triumph and joy of the resurrection, all this is because of God's love for each one of us. No matter who we are, what we've been through, or what we've done or not done. The passage in Romans reminds us why Jesus had to do this work of death and resurrection, and that is so that sin and death would be destroyed. Paul tells us in Romans that through baptism, that covenant we just reaffirmed, we have been buried with Christ into the death he died to sin. But then we have been raised from death with Christ so that death and sin no longer have dominion over us. Of course, sin, both the wrongs we do and the wrongs done against us, doesn't stop, but the power and control it has, that control it has over us is overcome the more Jesus is a part of our life. That's good news. That's why we rejoice tonight in the resurrection, the new life-giving love of God. These yearly celebrations and our weekly and more than weekly gatherings are because we desperately need to be reminded of God's love. Many of us were struggling before we were hit with the COVID-19 crisis. Now, because of the pandemic, we are all living in uncertainty. Now more than ever, we need to remember God's love for us. Some of us may be wondering why we're going through this global crisis, why we and others are suffering so much if God truly loves us. And when we find ourselves in that hard place, that's when we need each other to remind us of God's presence and love. Emmanuel, Jesus with us. We need to remember that Jesus is not afraid of our grief or our doubting or our anger or anything else. There is evidence aplenty in our Gospels that Jesus experienced all of it in one way or another, and Jesus saw and met it with compassion when he found it in others. I don't believe God causes our suffering, but it is sometimes hard to know why God, who has the power to prevent suffering, doesn't do so. I hope you can find, as I often do, comfort and consolation in knowing that God is present with us in our suffering. God in Jesus knows what suffering is and doesn't abandon us while we're in the midst of it. Again, that's why we celebrate this night. That's why we go through the salvation story, to remind ourselves anew of God's mercy and love, from creation to resurrection and beyond. Here are some of my favorite examples of God's tender care for us from tonight's readings. First, there's the Valley of Dried Bones and the fantastic imagery of those dried bones being knit together with sinews, muscles, and skin. And then finally, breath enters. And there's true life again. This is a hopeful vision to a nation that had been crushed, scattered, and decimated. And God tells Ezekiel to let them know that they will be brought back from the grave, receive God's Spirit, and live again. Next is the promise in Zephaniah that God will rejoice over the people and renew them by God's love. And finally, the empty tomb where God meets brave yet frightened women, first with an angel and then with Jesus himself, gently assuring the women that there's no need to be afraid. May these and the other salvation stories bring us hope in these frightening times. We are loved by God and we are not alone, even though we are isolated. Embrace hope and experience joy in the resurrection of Jesus, as well as in God's grace, peace, and love in these strange and difficult times. God is with us. Thanks be to God.